Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Heritage Talks Online. I'm your host, Dwayne Wilkin, and I'm here with Allison Kirkwood once again to introduce our guest speaker today, the scholar and community educator, Desiree Rochat. Most of us on this video call, I suspect, are old enough to remember what television was like before the digital age. In the 1960s and 1970s, when I was growing up, there were only a handful of TV channels to choose from. Shows were scheduled at fixed times, and commercial broadcasters largely controlled all the content and programming, which was unabashedly geared towards white audiences. Much has been said in recent years about the media revolution made possible by the internet and the rise of new communications platforms such as the ones we're using today. But it was Betty Riley who first harnessed the power of cable TV to help Black Montrealers unite around key social and political issues, including a shared experience of racism. Her weekly show, Black Is, went to air in 1971 and is regarded now as a milestone in Canadian broadcasting, a TV program tailored to the needs and realities of Black communities. We would probably not know about this unique contribution to Quebec history or Riley's own role as a Black community leader in Montreal were it not for a collection of archives donated to Concordia University by the Negro Community Center, the NCC. It was while working in this special collection, now housed at Vanier Library, that Desiree first learned about Riley and her pioneering work. The archivist, Alexandra Mills, who is now caring for that collection, is also with us today, and I hope by the end of Desiree's presentation that we can all begin to see these holdings not just as academic research materials, but as a source of inspiration for future stories and ongoing community engagement. Before we begin, let me take a moment to thank our major donors who have made the Heritage Talks series possible this season: the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Zeller Family Foundation, and Townshippers Foundation. Quan also received support from our member organizations across the province, and we are grateful to the hundreds of people who support us through subscriptions to our quarterly magazine, Quebec Heritage News. You can find more information about Quan and the work we do on our website, www.qahn.org. And please consider joining as a paid member to ensure that we can continue to bring you Heritage Talks along with workshops, conferences, exhibits, and special events. Today is a great day to join because Quan is offering first-time members a 30% discount off the usual price of a one-year subscription. That's just $20 for 4 issues of Quebec Heritage News. Please message Allison or me in the Zoom chat box or by Facebook Messenger to claim this offer, which is valid only until the end of today's presentation. A final word about technology. If you are joining us by Zoom, I'll ask you to please switch your webcam off during Desiree's presentation. Please do turn it back on during question and answer period. To speak your questions and comments aloud, just click on that yellow raise hand icon in the reactions box at the bottom of your screen to get my attention. You can also type questions and comments into the Zoom chat box or by Facebook Messenger. Our guest speaker today is an educator and a researcher who believes historical archives should strive to be places of learning and discovery that engage with all community members, not just academics and scholars. Guided by an approach that connects historical research, archival preservation, and education, her work aims to document, theorize, and transmit histories of Black community activism in Canada. She holds a PhD in Educational Studies from the Department of Integrated Studies in Education at McGill, and is currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of History at the University of Toronto. Desiree Rochat, welcome to Heritage Talks Online.
Thank you, Dwayne. And so, hi everyone, my name is Desiree Rochat, and as Dwayne introduced, I am a community educator first and foremost. Currently doing also academic work. Actually, I switched postdocs. I'm now at Concordia University again at the Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling for a postdoctoral on research on community heritage practices. And so what brings me to Betty Riley's story actually starts way before I encounter her story again at the archives at Concordia last year. but starts while I was a community worker in Little Burgundy, sort of overhearing stories of prior organizers and activists, and also hearing about the story of Black is. And a few years ago, a colleague of mine was trying to retrace the story of Black is and heard of some of the tapes that had been acquired, to use that word, by people who had gone into the building, sort of salvaged what they could have found, what they had found, and had found the tapes. And so in his quest to try to find the tape, we sort of started to dive in and try to understand what was Black is. That's when I first heard of Betty Riley. Unfortunately, we realized that the tapes had been then donated to Village des Valeurs and we could never retrace them, but Betty Riley's story stayed in my head. And so to my great pleasure, last year when I was doing the research residency at the Concordia Library Special Collections, I stumbled upon Betty's story again through the NCC archives, the Black Studies Center archive, and decided that it was the opportunity to dive back into it and learn more about her work and about herself. So the archival research, as I say, the research that I'm presenting today is based on archival research done with these main two archives, but also showcases other archives. And I want to point out before I start that all the photos that I'm going to show throughout the presentation are from the archives of Leon Llewellyn, who I see in the crowd with us. And I'll go back to Leon's work at the end of the presentation, but it was important for me to illustrate also this slice of history with some archival material that is held at special collections, and also that is done by someone who's active in the 70s as well. And so the way that it will work today, I'll have about 40 minutes of presentation and then open to discussion and exchanges. And I have to say, I'm really excited. I'm seeing names of people I know in the crowd. I am in no way proclaiming that this is the full story of Betty Riley and her work. I think this is really sort of preliminary research. But what I'm hoping to do in open conversations today is precisely to be able to sort of continue to learn about her work, to continue together to envision where archives of activists like Betty's could be held, and how we sort of can collectively envision writing a richer history of that period. So this is, as I say, only the beginning. I will now share my screen. Allison, I don't see the share button anymore. Oh, okay, sorry. Okay. No, I have it. I have it.
You got
Thanks.
it? Okay, perfect.
And here we go. And so the title of the presentation is Behind the Scenes with Betty Riley. On June 2nd, 1984, Beatrice Elizabeth Riley, more commonly known as Betty Riley, graduated from the University of Windsor in Ontario. She obtained a Bachelor of Arts in Communication Studies and a certificate in Organizational Communications. About that day, her sister wrote in the Afro-Can newspaper, "The day was superb. The sun shone for the whole week, in fact. Miss Beatrice Riley never looked so charming as she did that day. As she walked down that red carpet, the tears started rolling, especially for me. My big sister, 52 years of age, graduating. No one will ever know the pride I felt as I started to remember the education she could not pursue in her earlier years. The Rileys and the McIntyres constitute a huge family. So you could imagine one area in the stands, smiling, sniffing, and crying at the same time." Though her graduation marked the end of Miss Riley's formal university educational path in communications, it was in reality the culmination of more than a decade of trailblazing work in the field, and particularly in the sphere of Black media and communications. 13 years before graduating, Betty Riley had actually made history, not on stage, not with a university diploma, but with an idea she turned into a reality when she initiated Black Is, most likely the first Canadian TV show focusing on Black communities. Doing this, she became, by the same token, one of the first women TV producers in the country. And almost certainly, though I absolutely recognize I can't vouch 100% for it, but I'm pretty certain, the first Black woman TV producer in Canada. So today, what I want to do during the presentation is explore various facets of Betty Riley's work during the decade of the 70s and use them as entry points into the broader history of information and communication activism by Black communities across Montreal during that decade. I will go back on these terms in a moment to specify what I mean by that. So though Betty's achievements are the main threads of the story I will tell, it is important for me to also weave them in the tapestry of Black community life and activism in the city during that period. My presentation is structured around three broad and overlapping sections. First, I will set the context of the beginning of the decade and then explain a bit what I mean when I use terms communication and information activism. Second, I will explore part of Betty Riley's work and various mediums of communications used by Black communities for a variety of purposes. Again, I acknowledge the fact that there's surely much more to Betty's work than I've been able to uncover so far, but this is something that we can sort of dive into a bit more in the question and answer period at the end. And finally, I will conclude by reflecting on the role that communication attempted to play and played for activism and for Montreal's Black communities during that period. And so the early 70s were an important period of mobilization within Montreal's Black communities in general. The 60s had been marked by an increased immigration from certain Caribbean countries due to a combination of factors, such as the recruitment of Caribbean women through the domestic workers scheme, changes in immigration laws, and the increased brutality of the François Duvalier dictatorship in Haiti. This led to a growing number of people landing in Montreal for different reasons: work, family, studies, exile. And so these Caribbean migrants joined Montreal's already established, active, and diverse Black community. The middle of the decade of the 60s, I'm talking, saw the rise of a variety of island-based national groups, as well as political and student groups. These were, however, not the first Black institutions of the city. Those were actually founded in the first part of the 20th century. So the 60s marked a sort of second phase of institutionalization, and the 70s mark a third phase of institutionalization. Now, the 70s saw the rise of the Quebec community sector in general. And so it is in this context, on top of the 60s in Black Montreal, that led to the emergence of new constellation of Black activists and community workers in the city. And it is these constellations of activists and workers that were at the origin of this third wave of Black institutions in the 70s, especially of community organizations. And so, for instance, in 1972 alone, La Maison d'Haïti, the Quebec Board of Black Educators, le Bureau de la Communauté Chrétienne Haïtienne de Montréal, the Centenaire Rivet were founded. Between 72 and 73, the Black Studies Center, the Black Community Central Administration of Quebec were also founded, followed by satellite organizations of the NCC and the BCCAQ, the Black Community Associations in different neighborhoods of the city. And so for many of these groups, in addition to the programs and services they provided to community members, the dissemination of information was transversal to their work. And so now, without wanting to dwell on terminology, I think it's important before I continue to clarify some of the terms I use and also highlight the connections between communication, information, and community work, which will be the threads of the presentation. The three have a really intricate relationship. For community work to happen, knowledge and information need to be gathered and circulated. People need to know what is happening and people need to know why it's happening. It's the purpose of communication and information for activism. But communication and information gathering can also, in and of themselves, be forms of activism with the specific aim to foster community development, to transform society, to fight for social justice, and so on. This is part of the way Betty Riley understood it, as I can map through her work. This is communication as activism. So when I refer to information activism, I focus more on the ways that information is gathered, organized, and preserved as a labor for social justice. And so the fact of organizing documents, the fact of creating libraries, this is more about information activism. Whereas communication activism is rather related to the circulation and the transmission of this information and of knowledge through different means and mediums. Now, again, the two obviously go hand in hand, but I think it's important to name them and address them separately to do them justice, especially because information activism tends to be less visible and has often been a gendered work carried out by women. And so back to my story. The 70s were therefore a really active moment for Black community activism in the city, including for communication and information activism. And so it is in this context that while working as an office supervisor at the Montreal company cable T.V.L, Betty Riley grew increasingly concerned about the absence of the city's Black populations from most television productions, both on screen and behind the camera. A seventh-generation Canadian, she was aware that the history of her community and of the growing diversity within Montreal's Black communities was rarely made visible in the public sphere. And so she proposed a TV show to her superiors at Cable T.V.L to showcase various aspects of the life, the history, the presence, and the experiences of Black populations. From there came Black Is. And so Black Is aimed to present Black communities in their multiplicity for the general public, but also, and above all, for these communities themselves. Cable TV's only condition for supporting the show was that Miss Riley produced it. And there began a long learning process that eventually led to her 1984 graduation. To develop the show and embed her goal of uniting a diverse community, she approached Mr. and Mrs. Roberts, who were from St. Vincent. Their work together led to the airing on January 12, 1971, of the first episode of Black Is. The shows presented local community events, groups, and personalities, such as Lawrence Sittahall, the executive director of BCCAQ, Dorothy Wills from the National Black Coalition. It interviewed Black celebrities ranging from Sammy Davis Jr. to Stokely Carmichael. It presented some of the challenges faced by Black community members in relation to housing, immigration, the educational system, and much more. And so in addition to showcasing the different things that I explained, what was at the heart of Black Is was also the need to visualize Black community life in Montreal. By putting community events and groups on screen, the show remained firmly anchored in the city and projected an aspect of its urban life and its urban fabric that couldn't be seen elsewhere. And so this need to visualize and hear community stories also translated a few years later in multiple radio shows around the city. And so, for instance, in October 75, a proposal for a radio show was submitted by Ali André and Charles Dehoux from La Maison d'Haïti to Radio Centre-Ville. The show, La Voix d'Haïti, began shortly after and lasted about 8 years. Around the same time, the Bureau de la Communauté Chrétienne Haïtienne de Montréal hosted their own radio show called Combit Flamboyant. And so now Black Is eventually also paved the way for Black Speaks, a radio show that started in 75 and was hosted by Mr. Michael Paris. And so initiatives like Black Is and Black Speaks, La Voix d'Haïti, Combit Flamboyant, were efforts by Black communities to really put themselves on screen and on air as a way to assert a presence in the city, to connect with each other, but also to counter the distorted and often racist views of Black populations that were portrayed on mainstream media. These were explicit objectives of many of the shows. And so as Black Is evolved, Betty Riley gained experience and further learned her craft. And so through this, she also became increasingly bothered by the lack of opportunities for other Black community members, especially for youth, to learn the ropes of communications. This is what led her in 1973 to initiate her second communications endeavor, a program to train young Black Montrealers in the field of audiovisual communication. In collaboration with the Black Community Central Administration of Quebec and with support from the NCC and from cable TV, Betty launched the Black Youth Television Workshops on March 24th, 1973. Some of the workshops' main objectives were to provide training for youth in the use of communication media equipment to help participants in developing creative and artistic skills and art expression. And so the first cohort comprised 6 students who came from Côte-des-Neiges, NDG, and LaSalle, and through the NCC. Youth attended classes and training at cable TV studios. They undertook research to develop their areas and ideas, the areas that they would develop into ideas for the shows. They also learned to gather information on various subjects. They filmed community events, had their own show, but also collaborated with, filmed for, and produced episodes for Black Kids. And so Black Youth Television Workshops was really an educational project that both aimed to train a new generation of communication practitioners, but also aimed to produce educational material for the community. This educational aspect was explicit again in some of the objectives, which were to compile educational documentaries with audiovisual tapes, to provide educational materials for the community, to develop a research unit for teaching skills by compiling information in a professional way, and to develop a photography department to process pictures for television that could also be used and kept within the community for educational programs. And so as you can see through these objectives, the importance of education comes back over and over again. And so even if not all of this was necessarily achieved, what is interesting is to understand the vision that Betty Riley and some of her collaborators had of the role that communication could play for community education more broadly. And so this educational vision underlined the Black Youth Television Workshops, but also created the impetus for multiple collaborations, including, for instance, with the NCC library called the Stanley Clark Library. Initiated by the NCC director, Mr. Clark, in 1969, the library was opened after his abrupt passing in 1970. One of the library's main objectives was to participate in the expansion and development of Black consciousness, explicitly so. And it aimed to do so by focusing on Black authors, as well as books and resources about the realities, histories, and cultures of Black populations around the world. So the library, on top of the books, also collected different themes, organized sort of vertical files on subjects ranging from the historical communities in Africa to challenges in racism in Canada, to celebrities and Black historical figures across North America. And so the library, alongside some of the activities of the workshops of the Black Youth Television Workshops, focused on teaching youth how to compile information. This is in essence different aspects of the information activism that I explained earlier. As I said, though it comes hand in hand with communication, it does span a different realm of actions. And so it's very interesting that this information gathering was also part of the broader educational project. And so the Black Youth Television Workshops was therefore part of a much broader educational endeavor in which Betty actively participated. And so, for instance, in addition to the workshop's collaboration with the library, she also partnered with the Stanley Clark librarian Florence Davidson and other organizers to plan for Black History Week activities, amongst other things. And so for Ms. Riley, communications had to remain anchored in the community's needs, was a way to highlight community knowledge, and was intrinsic to a collective education project. It therefore had a role to play to foster community development. And so this is what underlined the broader vision of communication that Betty was developing over time. And so as this framework expanded, so did her ideas for an array of activities, of which I'm finding lists in the archives, but which led to the third important initiative she launched with different collaborators, the Black Community Communications Media. And so at the end of 1974, Mr. Carl Whitaker, who was a community organizer at the BCCAQ, approached Ms. Riley to start a conversation about formalizing her different community initiatives under one umbrella. And so Betty took the lead in collaboration with Carl and also with Lauren Sittahall, who was at the NCC at the moment, to structure what became the Black Community Communications Media in early 1975. And so the board was formalized at the beginning of 1975. But BCCM was in fact the institutionalization of that framework she had been developing over the years. Eventually, it also became an affiliate institution of the BCCAQ. And so on the slide, I show you the motto, which I think is very telling. BCC was formed to support and coordinate the various activities already underway, such as Black Is and Black Youth television workshops. But it was also created to help propel new activities that were envisioned, such as a Black community radio show, the Black Youth Research Department, Black Youth Photography Workshop, and a voice training program. The motto, we aim to serve through media, in this case, serving also meant using communication to foster collaborations between community groups. Now, interestingly, one of its first publications was a Black directory in 1978. The directory listed Black associations and organizations, lawyers, medical professionals, churches, businesses, and consulates and embassies. It's obviously an informative publication, but it also aimed to do more, as was written in the directory itself. The purpose, and I quote, "The purpose of this booklet is to put us in touch with each other. Use it. Black business and organization are worthy of our support. The publication of this directory is an extension of the aims and goals of the BCCM, an organization concerned with building and strengthening communicative ties in the Black community. It is part of the goals to ensure the development of a network of media services to enlighten and enhance Black awareness, leading to the achievement of a unity of purpose." This is a big goal for a directory, but I think it's really important in showing what the vision was behind such a directory. And so again, this explanation of the objectives of the booklet and of BCCM more broadly shows the framework that Betty was developing, and also show the importance of communication for community building and development. And so through BCCM, she really cemented her work and position, which stood at the crossroads of a communications expert and a community worker. And although the directory is a very specific type of format of publication, it also needs to be understood in relation to other community publications that emerged during that period that also had as part of their objectives to mobilize community members. As community organizations of the 70s expanded their programs and activities, a few of them also started to publish their own newsletters, journals, and publish political briefs and so on. And so in addition to their obvious function to transmit information, publications such as these also had as objectives to promote community events, bring awareness to communities' challenges. They aimed, in a sense, to connect people together. And so through this, the publications also showcased community life. They showcased Black Montreal through their pages. And so though their aim might sometimes have been overstated in relation to their actual impact on the ground, it doesn't make their objectives any less interesting and relevant to understand the importance of visualizing community life in that context. And it's interesting to see and to understand the role that people understood communication ought to have for community building. And so 3 examples of such community publications are Le Bulletin by La Maison d'Haïti, Focus Umoja by the BCCQ, and the Afrocan in collaboration with the NCC. And so La Maison d'Haïti, a Haitian community organization founded in the east of Montreal in 1972, started to publish its newsletter in 1975, when it really transformed into a community center. And so published over 3 periods between 75 and 1990, the objectives of the newsletter included establishing a community dialogue, analyzing the problems faced by community members, informing them of their rights, and reporting on local and Haitian news. In the mid-70s as well, the BCCQ launched Focus Umoja, a publication that aimed to reach various Black communities and actually aimed to include bilingual articles to do so. The objectives of the publication were to cover activities across the city to facilitate the coordination of Black community services and programs. And so you really see the goal and the attempt at uniting different organizations and different communities. And between approximately 81 and 87, the AfroCan was published as an extension of the NCC's activities. Now, even if it's after the 70s, I thought it was necessary to mention it here. One of its primary objectives was to highlight social and political concerns at the local, provincial, national, and international levels, specifically from the perspectives of Afro-descendant populations. Interestingly, the center page also often displayed photos of community events. And so these, as well as other community publications, offered their respective communities spaces of written communication, obviously. People expressed and positioned themselves on various subjects, sometimes even confronting each other through the pages of the newsletters. They displayed themselves and their communities through their words and the images that accompanied the articles. And so ultimately, these publications, though varied in format and content, put forward the visions, perspectives of members of Montreal's Black communities on a variety of topics, from politics to the arts, from social issues to community achievements. Interestingly, in many of these newsletters and journals, articles were also written about historical events and figures, whether at the local, national, or international scale. Now, this sort of Black historical transmission participated in the attempt at constructing a vision of a common past, in essence, a vision of a common community past. Now, tellingly, Betty Riley also wrote in certain community publications, for instance, in the Black Voice in 1972. In the June edition, I believe, of the Black Voice in 1972, she actually penned an article entitled "Forever Beginning What Shall Never End," about the history of the Colored Women's Club and the foundation of the LCC. And so in the same way that Black community communications media aimed to enlighten and enhance Black awareness, leading to the achievement of a unity of purpose, so did community publications and the article they circulated, including on history. And so as mediums of communication like the publications, the TV and radio shows increasingly took the Black Montreal stage during the 70s, the same was also happening across Canada. And so BCCM, as part of its umbrella role, and also because of its motto, which I put on the slides again now, decided to create a space to bring people together on the topic of Black media and communication, organizing the first ever Pan-Canadian conference devoted specifically to Black communication practices and practitioners. And so in April 1977, the Black Media Conference was held in Montreal. In addition to bringing communication specialists together to reflect on their work, analyze their common challenges, and build relationships, the conference was also to be a place of exchange and of debates. The invitation letter itself stated that, although we are certain that some good will come out of simply socializing with our colleagues in the print and electronic media, we firmly intend to conduct productive and even provocative workshops. These, we are sure, will benefit all of us on our day-to-day struggles to improve our impact as communicators. So whereas BCCM, Black Community Communications Media, aimed to participate in the building of Montreal's local Black communities, the conference aimed to forge a pan-Canadian community of communication practitioners. And so people such as Al Hamilton, the publisher of the Contrast newspaper in Toronto, Mr. Francis, executive director of Brick Community Media, Wayne Adams, producer of Black Journal in Halifax, and many more were present at the conference in Montreal. And the second conference happened in Toronto the following year. And so though it was the first to focus specifically on communication and media, the Black Media Conference happened at a time where conferences, symposium, guest speaker events were occurring frequently in Black community groups. These events were organized to provide opportunities for people to learn, to debate, to exchange, to socialize, and to build networks. In essence, they provided collective intellectual and political spaces. And so in an interview in Focus Umoja about the second Black Media Conference of 1978, Betty actually recognized the importance of conferences for debates and growth, as she said something about some of the heated discussions that had happened at the conference of 1978. And so what she said was, and I quote, "I don't see anything wrong with emotions, so long as something constructive emerges. I think the voicing of opinions is what a conference is supposed to be about, be the opinions heated or otherwise." Now, the movement for this type of events in the 70s, a type of event which are ultimately communication events, really began in the 60s. And so between 65 and 68, there was a series of conferences organized by a group called the Caribbean Conference Committee, which indirectly led to the Congress of Black Writers at McGill in 68, which was followed by the Hemispheric Conference a month later. And sort of this impetus continued in the 70s, when you had, for instance, in the 1974, the second conference of the National Congress of Black Women, organized by the Montreal Regional Committee, or an event like the Symposium, focused on the education and liberation, organized by the Black Students Association of Dawson, McGill, and Concordia, as well as many other conferences and public events. And so many guest speakers were also invited to talk at community events and community organizations during the era, such as Angela Davis, pictured here in 1974. And so interestingly, on the bottom left picture, Angela can be seen with who I'm pretty certain is Maisie Dash from the Colored Women's Club. People in the audience at the end might confirm. But also with Adeline Chancy from La Maison d'Haïti. Both of these women were important figures in their respective communities. The Guyanese historian, professor and political activist Walter Rodney came around 1975 as well. Funnily enough, when I zoomed on this portrait to prepare the PowerPoint for this presentation, I realized that the woman right in front of Walter Rodney on the picture is most likely Adeline Chancy once again. Stokely Carmichael also came multiple times, including in the NCC around 75 as well, as pictured here. And so therefore, though the Black Media Conference of 77, is a different format, once again, it takes place at a moment where there are multiple public communication activities that happen at the same time. And basically these communication activities, as I call them, are open discussion spaces and intellectual exchanges in community settings. Conferences, symposium, guest speaker events are clearly understood in that moment to be not just for the academic realm, but also for the community. And so these events, alongside the other communication and information activities undertaken by Betty Riley and other fellow Black Montrealers during the 70s, were also part of a larger and longer tradition of community and communication activism, as noted by Al Hamilton during his talk at the Black Media Conference of 77. And he said, "We have always had then to protect ourselves from individual, historical, and institutional racism by fostering a strong sense of community, by letting other Blacks know of our sorrows, joy, hard work, and achievement. Very often, information alone put together by ourselves was what sustained us and let us know the true story behind the official distortion and misinformation grudgingly given to us." And I just want to point out that the information is in bold in the original. I did not bolden it for the purpose of this, but it's just to show the importance that is given to that word in the context of this activist sort of tradition. And so Betty Riley's work behind the camera was first and foremost rooted in her community work and remained so throughout her career. Not only did she understand that communication needed to be thought of broadly through different mediums, but she also understood and made it very explicit that it was intricately connected to the growth and the advancement of her community. In return, The only way to advance Black community communication and media was to implicate community members at all levels, as she explained in 1978. She said, when we talk of media, one of the things we should take into account is the education of the community. And this should not begin and end with the printed media. We must also realize that community development, involvement, and achievement are important to the development of different aspects of the media. And this is something she attempted to do through all her communications endeavor over the decades that she worked in the field. Black is and Black Speaks aim to visualize and hear Black community life. Black youth television workshops participated in a wider community education project. Black community communications media and community publications more broadly allowed to document and narrate this community life, while conferences and speaking events created opportunities to debate and envision new ways of doing. And so this brings me back to the beginning of the presentation to conclude it. Now, again, even if some of the initiatives I presented here today didn't always manage to achieve all their aims, what I think is important to remember about the work that was done in the 70s is that it illustrates that people understood the potential of the connection between communication, information, and community work. They not only understood, but also envisioned the role that communication ought to play in building and strengthening communities. Basically, the role that communication activism ought to play for community activism. So whether it was to inform people, to connect people across the city and across languages, to negotiate and articulate a plurality of identities and perspectives, and ultimately to foster a sense of community belonging through diversity. And so the people I see as communication and information activists of the 70s might not use these terms to define themselves. Part of the reason I do, and actually make it a point to name it as such, is because of the importance of their labor for the past, for the present, and for the future. And this is for sort of two main reasons. First, because I think it's necessary to make visible the work that they did behind the cameras or behind their typewriters. To be able to acknowledge the multiplicity of community activist practices that make our history. In the current moment of hypervisibility of social media activism, I think it's necessary to highlight that people work for the better of their communities in different and sometimes less visible ways, and that communication is much more than digital based. Now, the second thing, and the second reason, is because it's the work of these activists that was done in the 70s, in the 80s, and even before. That is what makes it possible for people like me to research this history now. And so, for instance, the work to document and visualize Black community life that Leon Llewellyn undertook through his photography in the 70s is what has allowed me to see and to show the history that I'm writing about. Hence me purposefully using his photography to illustrate the PowerPoint today. Leon is a multidisciplinary artist, and photography is only one of his many artistic talents. But the work he did through his photography, which was published in outlets such as Focus Umoja, was to create visual records that we can now use. And so the people who wrote and produced community publications created a textual record of community life as well. And now the work of information activists was as important. And it is those who preserve this material. And so, for instance, the work of Dr. Dorothy Williams to salvage the NCC archive, and her work also to organize a lot of the Black Studies Center archives, which are both now held at Concordia, is basically what allows me now to be able to conduct a lot of the research presented here today. And so though they are now formally archived at Concordia, I think it's important to remember that the reason that why they were able to come in the first place is because people did that work of preservation, of organization and documentation way before. And the work of these information and communication activists was therefore crucial so that we can continue to learn about the life of Betty Riley and of other Black community members who, like her, made history behind the scenes. Thank you. And so here are my references that I can share later. I just want to acknowledge the sources.
Trying to get my microphone off. Thank you so much. That is very impressive. That is what a story, and what a way that you have of bringing it out. I just have to jump in right now because somebody in the chat room is asking the exact question that I have at the top of my mind. Are there any copies of Black Is today available to be watched? I know that you mentioned yesterday in our call that they ended up in a village des valeurs, a lot of them that were the copies that were at the, I think, the NCC prior to going to Concordia. But maybe this is a time to put the call out to the community. Are there any copies of Black Is for posterity's sake anywhere? Would you?
So this is something that I would actually like to ask the crowd, because this collection of tapes that we tried to track down a few years ago are the only ones that I and my colleague who was doing the research at the time, Kai Thomas, had been able to sort of locate and hear about. And unfortunately, they were indeed transferred to Village des Valeurs, which then got rid of them. And so I, as of now, haven't yet been able to locate copies of Black Is, but what I'm trying to do through the archives is also see if I can at least maybe map out some of the content of the shows. That's why, I found some list of, themes, people that were interviewed, to at least have an idea of what was presented on there. But it is now part of a bigger puzzle that I think can only be collectively solved, to try to see if some of these tapes still exist.
You covered a lot of ground in this presentation, Desiree. There was one area that is close to my heart, and it has to do with the community journalism aspect of it. You just explicitly didn't use the word journalism, and maybe I'll ask you to explore that a little bit as well. But when you're describing the training workshops that Ms. Riley got underway in the early 70s after Black Is started, I couldn't help thinking that reminds me of a broadcast journalism course. Something that that young people today might be able to get at Concordia or other journalism schools. Was that effectively what it was? I mean, was she basically organizing and getting going a broadcast journalism course for Black students in Montreal in the early 70s?
I mean, that is when I look at the programs and when the classes that we're giving for Black Youth Television Workshop, it is a very all-encompassing curriculum. And so, I mean, I can't say that it was specifically a journalism class, but what is very clear to me is that it wasn't random, and then B, it was very all-encompassing, right? And so it was to teach people as much to do the research, to develop their ideas, as the technical skills. Now, what, again, I pointed out in the presentation, what is interesting is the workshops were meant to have sort of this double educational component. The youth were to have, training in communications, but the material that they were producing was also to have an educational component for the community, right? And so I think it was every occasion that she found through her work, the educational aspect, the aspect of training other people, of transmitting information was constant, right? And so the workshops, again, are only a small part of a wider project that she undertook through her career.
I just want to pass on a comment or two that we've been receiving from Facebook, and which you won't be able to see, but Jody Robinson, who is an archivist, incidentally, she's the trained archivist, but now the executive director of the Eastern Townships Resource Center at Bishops, wants to thank you so much for bringing attention to the important work that goes into the process of records, making it into an archives for preservation. And I think you've already acknowledged that a lot of that is due to Dr. Dorothy Williams, who's on the call today. As well, and others who have had the vision to preserve these records. Now housed, by the way, at the Vanier Library, is that correct?
Yeah, so Special
Yeah.
Collections has a series of these archives, including the NCC, the Black Studies Center, Leon Llewellyn's archive, Graham Clark's archive. And so there are a multiplicity of archives there. But what I think is important to understand about these archives is that though they're a really interesting collection, they're definitely not a complete collection. And also that though they're formally archived now, there's been tremendous work by people in the community sector itself to also preserve different collections, right? And so I think it's important for us to understand that when archives enter formal institutions, they're actually really part of a bigger archival ecosystem, some of which is very much more informal, but that is as important as well, right? And again, like the labor of caring for these archives sometimes is done by a professional, but is often done by community members themselves. And this is the explicit reason to make work visible, right? To make different forms of activism visible. And so people who, build community libraries, people who preserve community archives, their work is never at the forefront when we think of social activism, but it's as important, and especially in the context of, Black communities and other racialized communities in Canada.
There's a lot to dig in here, and of course, you've just touched the surface. But I also want to ask you a bit about one of the stated purposes. I think it was one of the stated purposes of the BCCM, but it may have been through your reading one of Betty Riley's visions for getting involved with Black Is to begin with, and later communication activist initiatives. And that was to unite the Black communities in the city of Montreal, of course, but elsewhere in Canada. Do you get a sense that she ever felt that her work had made progress in that regard? And what were some of the challenges that she faced in doing that and bringing together, I guess, not only people who may have been from various islands in the Caribbean and who came here in the 60s and 70s, but older Black communities that had been here for generations? Can you speak to that a little bit about what?
No, I think that would be speculation at this point. I think this is part of sort of the continued work. As I say, as of now, my research I really wanted to start by sort of mapping and tracing what she did and the vision that she had. And so that was important for me. That's why, it was reading her interviews, trying to understand how she understood communication, trying to look at the objectives that she set through her programs. And hopefully, as I'm able to maybe find some more written material of her, then I would maybe have a better understanding of some of the challenges or maybe some of the reorientations that she had. But, seeing and reading the interviews, I think she was very aware that communities are not something that just happened. I always say, you can put 10 people, 20 people into a room, into a neighborhood. It doesn't make for a community. Communities is something that is built over time. It's the way that people engage with each other. It's it's the things that people do together. That's what makes a community. And when I read through, again, some of her interviews and some of her documentation, what I realized is that's something that she was really clear about. It's that the community needed to be built, which is why I thought it was so interesting, her understanding of the space of conferences, right? It's okay for conferences to be spaces of heated debates, because this is what we also need if we're going to do things together and develop collective things, right? And so hopefully maybe later I'll be able to better understand some of the challenges she faced and the way that she also circumvented these challenges. But she was very aware of the diversity of experiences and perspectives, and really understood that communication could be a tool to create bridges across communities. And so, for instance, Black Is showcased activities from La Maison d'Haïti in 1977. Later in the 80s, it also presented a few series of French classes on TV. And so there was always that attempt, right, at finding different ways to connect across languages, which also meant connecting across different cultural communities within the Black communities.
Desiree, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that on the call today, and I hope, I don't usually do this, but we have a couple of viewers, participants who have let me know through email that they actually knew Betty Riley personally and were interested in coming to the in-person meeting that we had unfortunately to cancel this week. They are Brenda Paris and Yvonne Greer. I wonder if Yvonne or Brenda, you would like to ask a question or share a comment or a memory of Betty Riley while you're on the call. If you would like to, I can unmute you and turn your camera on for you. Should I go ahead and do it, Allison, or we'll wait for I'll wait for you two to decide. Just give me a signal. You can turn your camera on or turn your microphone on, and we'll begin. You can join in the conversation. We'd really like to hear from you if you can do that. In the meantime, I do have a question has come in from Lori McLaughlin from Facebook, and she asks a very sensible question given Betty Riley's apparent, importance as a community leader. Is there a public library, a media center, a sculpture, or a plaque to honor her that you are aware of? I think I know the answer.
Mm-hmm. Not that I know of. And I think this, if the preservation of these archives is one aspect, I think the public commemoration that we need to do based on these archives is the future part of the conversation, right? And so I think having talks like this, but also really trying to find moments and places to bring this information out in the public. I'm sorry, but outside of Black History Month, because this is Canadian history, right? Demands some forms of creativity as well. And so, as I said, I am pretty certain from what I found so far that she's the first Black woman TV producer. I am yet to be confirmed or infirmed. This is something that once I'm 100% sure, then I will fully state it, but I put the, maybe now. But it's huge. It's really, really huge. And so I think that it's also, we need to recognize different figures, right? Because when we commemorate, when we create plaques, when we create monuments, we tend to also commemorate people that are more visible. So people that do more visible, activist, political work, artistic work. The truth of the matter is there's always people in the background. There's always people pushing and shoving. And so I think it's not just how we commemorate, but also who we commemorate and what we understand history to be. Right? And so commemorating just to commemorate, no, but I think it's when we will try to find ways to bring out different forms of historical commemorations, that will be interesting, right?
Yeah, well put.
If I can put, to me, it's very, so Betty does this trailblazing work, but I find and this is why it was important for me to start with the little article that her sister wrote about her, is that, Betty, you can feel she's also part of this bigger community, this bigger family, as she said, the Rileys and the McIntyres, who are also sort of behind her and are there at her graduation. And so Betty also has a broader history that we can't keep out of the context, right?
Yvonne Greer has raised her hand, so I'm going. Come on in.
Can you hear me? I'm unmuted.
Yes, you're unmuted. Yeah.
Okay.
I'd love to see you.
I'm not coming on screen, so
okay.
you'll have to
No
settle
problem
for my voice. But unfortunately, there aren't many people around who remember Betty.
Mm-hmm.
And Betty left Montreal quietly. A lot of us didn't even know when she left. Mm-hmm. And she went back home to Windsor. However, I'll talk about when I first met Betty. This was right after the Sir George Williams event, mm-hmm. to put it mildly. And after the students had been arrested and were coming out of jail, and we were doing fundraisers and various activities, community, teaching people in the community or informing about, what had really taken place at at Sir George. And we had a little office on St. Antoine Street near Atwater. And I was there a lot of the time. That's when Uhuru came into being. And a lot of the older people, Betty wasn't that old, but, you know, older than the students then, and who were grounded in the community, sort of. And as many of the students had come from abroad, many of the islands, and even from the US, what happened was the more grounded older people in the community sort of didn't want to associate with the students because they had caused an upheaval. However, I remember being in the office one day and Betty walked in, and I thought, oh God, she's going to tell us off. She's going to tell, I think I was alone. I'm going to tell us off. What are you doing? And instead, Betty had brought a donation to help out with the expenses incurred for students' legal fees and so on. And she was so gracious and so kind. And she, you know, we didn't know each other, but it was almost as if, you know, a family member had come to help out. And from then on, Betty and I got along very well. We weren't together all the time, but well respected by me. And she was super kind, super friendly, and super loving.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for sharing that story, Yvonne.
You're welcome.
It's interesting to have that story of just a little before she starts, you know, all this communication work, because what is really impressive to me in, you know, the documentation she produces, all the interviews she gives, is her real commitment to community. In one of the I think it's in the interview in the Focus Umoja, but I'm not sure. She, again, you know, she says like something like communication cannot be the purview of experts only. Community has to be involved. And so to me, that sort of commitment to sort of break down expertise, but also to understand that this is a collective thing. We're only going to make it if we make it together. In the story that you say is also sort of echoed, right? It's sort of that community commitment that she carried through her work, and that I think.
Well, she just knew that there was something needed. Funds were needed. She wasn't rich, didn't have big funds, but you know, and that was the kind of expression that she came with. It might not be much, but I'm here and I'm ready to support. And to get involved. And she was one of maybe two in her age group then, or, you know, who came forward and was ready to be part of it.
Wow, this is really beautiful to know.
Thank you for that, Yvonne. Much appreciated. I'll ask the people in the meeting again. Once again, if you have a question or a comment, please do so. Just click that yellow raise hand icon in the reactions box, and you'll grab my attention. We have a comment here from Leon. Leon, the photographer who supplied you with some of the images you used in your presentation. Some of the rare photographs, by the way, because I couldn't find any images of Betty when I was just making up that ad for today's talk. But Leon comments that Yvonne played an important role in Focus Umoja. So I get the connection now. Okay. Anyway, thank you, Yvonne, for joining today. And thank you all for coming to today's presentation. I think at this moment we'll bring it to a close. I just will remind everybody that today's event is recorded, and it will be available on the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network Facebook page. It's a public site, so you don't need to actually be on Facebook in order to access this video and any of the others that we have recorded in the Heritage Talk series this season and in previous seasons. So do check us out. That's Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network, Facebook. Thanks again, Desiree, for great work, and I congratulate you on the work you're doing to uncover this history. Last chance for a comment or a question to Desiree before I wrap things up. I don't see any takers, so have a great day, everybody. Oh, go ahead, Desiree. Yeah.
No, and I just want to thank everyone for being here, and also everyone for supporting this work. I always say, even though, you know, I might be the one presenting now, I never do this kind of, you know, presentation and this kind of research work on my own. And I really think it's sort of a continuation of a community endeavor. And so as I see Alexandra Mills, who's at Special Collections at Concordia, Dorothy, who was there, as I say, I couldn't do this work if Dorothy hadn't done this work before, you know, same for Leon. I see Brenda also, who actually is one of the organizers of the symposium in 1974 on education and liberation. And so I think it's also, when we understand this as a collective project, A, it makes it more fun, and B, it makes it that we can really learn together. And so I really hope that this is also the continuation of sort of collective research done together.
Thank you to all, and have a great day.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.